Beneath the streets of a city drowning in its own blood, 21 human beings crawled through a river of waste, their hands clawing at slime-covered brick, their lungs burning with the stench of rot and ammonia. The year was 1943, and above them, in the Polish city of Lviv, the Nazi machinery of death operated with industrial precision. The ghetto was being liquidated. Families were being torn apart on cobblestone streets, slick with rain and blood. Children were being ripped from their mothers' arms and thrown onto trucks destined for the gas chambers of Belzec. But below, in the darkness so complete it devoured hope itself, a different kind of hell was unfolding. These 21 souls, 10 men, 10 women and 1 child, had made a choice that defied every human instinct. They had descended into the sewers of Lviv, trading the open sky for eternal night, fresh air for toxic fumes, and the illusion of freedom for the cold certainty of entombment. And the only thing standing between them and certain death was a man they barely knew. A Catholic Polish sewer worker, an encanador, a man who, by every logical measure, should have turned them in for the reward money the Nazis were offering for Jewish heads. Leopold Socha was not supposed to be a hero. He was a 34-year-old municipal worker with calloused hands and a reputation among his neighbors as someone who enjoyed a drink and knew how to make a little extra money on the side. Before the war, he had been a petty thief, someone who understood the underground tunnels of Lviv not as monuments to municipal engineering, but as highways for stolen goods. He knew every pipe, every junction, every chamber where the city's waste collected before flowing into the Poltva River. His job was to maintain the flow, to clear blockages, to ensure that the filth of 60,000 people moved efficiently through the intestines of the city. It was unglamorous work, the kind that kept him invisible to the middle class and the intellectuals who filled Lviv's famous cafes before the Wehrmacht rolled in. But that invisibility, that intimate knowledge of the world beneath the world, would transform him into something unexpected. It would make him the architect of the most audacious rescue operation most Americans have never heard of. Lviv, in 1943, was a city that had already died twice. First, the Soviets had occupied it in 1939 under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, implementing their own brand of terror, deporting thousands of Poles to Siberian labor camps. Then, in June of 1941, the Germans arrived, and what followed was a descent into a darkness that made Soviet oppression look almost merciful by comparison. The Jewish population of Lviv, which had numbered over 150,000 souls before the war, was being systematically erased. The Nazis had established a ghetto, cramming families into a few city blocks, and then methodically began the actions, the roundups, the selections, the deportations. By the spring of 1943, nearly everyone understood what deportation meant. The rumors had stopped being rumors. Belzec was not a labor camp, it was a death factory. And the ghetto, once home to tens of thousands, was being emptied block by block, building by building, room by room. It was in this context of total annihilation that a small group of Jewish families made a decision that seemed insane. Led by a man named Ignacy Chaiga, a former office worker who had somehow maintained his sanity and his will to survive, they approached Leopold Socha with a proposition. They knew he worked in the sewers. They knew he understood the labyrinth below the city. And they were willing to pay him, offering whatever money and valuables they had managed to hide from the Nazi confiscations, if he would help them disappear into that labyrinth. Socha's initial motivation was not heroism. It was money. He needed it. His family needed it. And these desperate people were offering it. But what started as a transaction, a cold exchange of zlotys for access to a hiding place, would evolve into something that defied the calculus of wartime survival. It would become a test of what one man could endure, not physically, but morally. The descent into the sewers happened in stages throughout May and June of 1943, as the final liquidation of the Lviv ghetto accelerated. Families carrying almost nothing, wrapped in whatever clothing they could layer onto their bodies, followed Socha through access points he had scouted. They climbed down iron ladders slick with algae, their feet finding purchase on rungs that had not been designed for this kind of traffic. They waded through channels where the water reached their waists, where rats the size of house cats scattered at their approach, where the air was so foul that breathing became a conscious act of will. Socha led them deep into the network, far from the main access points, to a chamber he had identified. It was a junction point where several tunnels converged, a space perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for a grown man to stand if he hunched his shoulders. This would be home. This would be the world. And Socha made them understand with absolute clarity that survival meant absolute silence, absolute discipline, and absolute trust in him. By mid-June of 1943, 21 people were living in that chamber beneath Lviv. 10 men, 10 women, and a 7-year-old girl named Krystyna Chiga. They had no sunlight. They had no fresh air. They had no bathroom except the flowing sewage around them. They had no certainty that Socha would return each day with the bread and water he promised. And yet, they had made their choice. Above them, the city continued its dance of death. The Gestapo roamed the streets. Ukrainian auxiliary police hunted for hidden Jews with dogs and metal rods to probe walls and floors. Informants turned in their neighbors for a kilogram of sugar or a bottle of vodka. But below, in the fetid darkness, 21 people clung to the thinnest thread of hope. And that thread was a sewer worker who had every reason to betray them and only one reason not to. His conscience. The sewers of Lviv were not designed for human habitation. They were designed to remove human waste, industrial runoff and rainwater from a city that had been built and rebuilt over centuries, its foundations resting on medieval stones, its infrastructure a patchwork of Austrian, Polish, and Soviet engineering. The main tunnels were brick-lined channels, some wide enough for a man to walk upright, others requiring crawling on hands and knees through spaces barely 2 feet high. The water that flowed through them was not simply dirty, it was chemically aggressive, a toxic soup of excrement, urine, industrial solvents, and decaying organic matter that ate away at skin, turned minor cuts into infected wounds, and filled the air with gases that could render a person unconscious or blind. The temperature underground remained relatively constant, hovering around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant the refugees were perpetually cold, their bodies never fully dry, their clothing rotting off their frames within weeks. And then there were the rats. The rats of Lviv's sewers were not ordinary rodents. Decades of living in abundance, feeding on the endless buffet of human waste, had turned them into creatures of horrifying size and aggression. Some were as large as small dogs, their bodies sleek and muscular, their teeth yellowed but sharp enough to tear through leather boots. They moved in packs, their eyes glowing red in the dim light of the candles Socha occasionally brought. At first, the refugees tried to fight them off, swinging sticks and throwing stones. But the rats were relentless, and they quickly learned that these new inhabitants of their domain were weak, exhausted, and unable to mount any sustained defense. The rats crawled over sleeping bodies. They bit exposed skin. They dragged away any scrap of food left unguarded for even a moment. Krystyna Chiga, the 7-year-old girl, would later remember waking up to find a rat gnawing on her hair, its weight pressing down on her face, its hot breath against her cheek. Her mother had to strangle it with her bare hands. Leopold Socha visited the chamber almost every day, descending into the sewers through access points scattered across the city, carrying bread, potatoes, and occasionally a jar of soup or a piece of sausage. He moved with the confidence of a man who had spent years in this underworld, navigating by memory and instinct, his movements economical and precise. But each visit was a calculated risk. If anyone saw him carrying food into the sewers, if anyone noticed his pattern of movements, if anyone grew suspicious and reported him to the authorities, he would be executed. The Nazi policy on aiding Jews was absolute. There were no exceptions, no trials, no appeals. Discovery meant death not just for Socha, but for his wife Wanda and their young daughter. And yet, he kept coming. He brought news from the surface, whispered reports of the war's progress, of Soviet advances in the east, of Allied landings in Italy. He became their only connection to the world of light and air, their only evidence that such a world still existed. But Socha's role evolved beyond that of a mere supplier. He became a problem solver, an engineer of survival in an environment that fought human life at every turn. When the chamber flooded during heavy rains, threatening to drown the refugees in sewage, Socha engineered a drainage system, digging channels and installing makeshift pumps. When the air became so foul that people began passing out, he located ventilation shafts and cleared blockages, creating pathways for slightly fresher air to circulate. When disease began to spread, dysentery and typhus claiming victims who had survived the initial shock of descent, he smuggled in basic medicines, aspirin and iodine and bandages, purchased on the black market with money he often did not have. He became their doctor, their priest, their link to sanity. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the nature of his motivation began to shift. What had started as a mercenary arrangement, cash for concealment, was transforming into something deeper, something he himself did not fully understand. The psychological toll of life underground manifested in ways both predictable and strange. Arguments erupted over nothing, over a perceived slight or an unequal distribution of bread. Couples who had loved each other for decades turned bitter and resentful, their intimacy stripped away by the complete lack of privacy. Some people retreated into catatonic silence, sitting for hours in the same position, staring at brick walls they could barely see. Others became obsessively talkative, whispering endless streams of memories, recounting their lives before the descent as though repetition could resurrect what had been lost. Ignacy Chaiga, the de facto leader of the group, tried to maintain structure, assigning tasks, organizing a schedule, insisting on basic hygiene despite the impossibility of cleanliness. But his authority was fragile, built on consensus rather than power. And there were moments when the group teetered on the edge of complete collapse, when the darkness threatened to consume not just their bodies, but their humanity itself. The first death came in the third week. An elderly man named Weinberg, who had been struggling with a persistent cough since before the descent, simply stopped breathing one night. His body grew cold in the darkness, and the group faced a problem they had not anticipated. They could not bury him. They could not perform the rituals that Jewish law demanded. They could not even keep his body, because in the heat and humidity of the sewers, decomposition would begin within hours, bringing disease and an unbearable stench to an already unbearable situation. When Socha arrived the next morning, they told him what had happened, and he made the decision for them. He wrapped Weinberg's body in a tattered blanket, hoisted it over his shoulder, and carried it through the tunnels to a location far from the hiding chamber. There, in a side passage rarely used, he laid the body in the flowing sewage and watched as the current carried it away, toward the Poltvar River, toward an unmarked grave in the city's waterways. He never told the group exactly where Weinberg ended up. Some things were better left unknown. The rhythm of survival became brutally simple. Wake in total darkness because there was no dawn. Eat whatever Socha brought, dividing it with mathematical precision to ensure everyone received an equal portion. Drink water that had been boiled over a small camping stove Socha had smuggled in, a device that consumed precious oxygen and filled the chamber with smoke but made the difference between life and cholera. Relieve yourself in a designated corner, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity in an inherently undignified act. And then wait. Wait for Socha's next visit. Wait for news. Wait for the war to end. Wait for liberation. Wait for anything that might signal that this nightmare had a conclusion. Time lost all meaning. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Some people scratched marks into the brick walls to track the passage of time, but others stopped caring, stopped counting, stopped believing that time was a linear progression toward anything resembling a future. Socha's own life above ground became a performance of normalcy that required extraordinary discipline. He continued his job as a municipal sewer worker, clocking in and out with the same reliability he had shown before the war. He attended church with his wife Wanda, who knew about the Jews and supported his decision. Despite the terror it brought into their home, he socialized with neighbors, many of whom were openly anti-Semitic, who praised the Nazi cleansing of Lviv, who believed that the city was better off without its Jewish population. He laughed at their jokes. He nodded at their observations. He played the role of the simple workingman who cared only about his next paycheck and his next drink. But beneath that performance, he was conducting a rescue operation of staggering complexity. He was stealing food from his own family's rations, He was spending money they did not have on black market goods. He was lying to everyone around him, maintaining a double life that would have destroyed most men under the weight of its moral contradictions. The refugees developed strategies to preserve their sanity in an environment designed to obliterate it. Some people created mental routines, reciting prayers at specific times, performing memory exercises, reconstructing entire books they had read in their previous lives. Ignacy Chiga, who had been an educated man, began teaching his daughter Christina mathematics and history in whispered lessons, using his finger to write equations in the slime on the walls. His wife Paulina organized a system for maintaining personal hygiene, insisting that people wash their hands and faces in the cleaner sections of water flow, that they comb their hair despite the lice, that they change positions regularly to prevent bed sores. These small acts of civilization, these refusals to surrender entirely to the degradation of their circumstances, became acts of resistance. They were assertions that they remained human beings, not animals, not insects, not the vermin the Nazis claimed they were. But there were also moments of complete despair, moments when the darkness became too heavy to bear. A woman named Clara Kahler attempted to drown herself in the sewer channel, wading into the deepest section of water and simply lying down, allowing the current to cover her face. She was pulled out by two men who heard her splashing, who dragged her back to the chamber and held her while she sobbed, her body racked with a grief so profound it seemed to have no bottom. Another man, Mundek Margulies, began talking about leaving, about climbing back to the surface and turning himself into the Nazis, convinced that even a quick death by bullet was preferable to this slow dissolution of the soul. Socha talked him down during one visit, gripping his shoulders and telling him in harsh, urgent whispers that suicide was a sin, that surrender was unacceptable, that they had come too far to give up now. But Socha's words were not religious comfort. They were the words of a man who had invested too much of himself to watch his investment crumble. The winter of 1943 brought new terrors to the underground world. Above ground, temperatures in Lviv plummeted to well below zero, and the effects rippled through the sewer system in ways the refugees had not anticipated. The water flow slowed to a trickle as pipes froze, which meant the waste accumulated in stagnant pools around their chamber, raising the level of filth they waded through daily. The cold seeped through the brick and concrete, turning their refuge into a frozen tomb, where breath came out in visible clouds, and hypothermia became a constant threat. They huddled together for warmth, bodies pressed against bodies, the boundaries between individuals dissolving into a single organism, focused solely on generating enough heat to survive until morning. Socha brought blankets, thin and inadequate, but anything was better than nothing. He also brought news that the Soviet army was advancing westward, pushing the Germans back village by village, town by town. It was the first real hope they had received in months, but hope was a dangerous commodity underground. It made time move slower. The psychological fractures within the group widened as the months accumulated. Couples who had entered the sewers together began to fracture under the strain. A man named Weinbergova accused his wife of hoarding food, of eating more than her share when others were sleeping. She denied it with a vehemence that suggested guilt, and the accusation poisoned their relationship beyond repair. They stopped speaking to each other, even though they sat less than 3 feet apart every day. Another couple, the Weinbergs, who had lost their teenage son during the initial liquidation of the ghetto, descended into a shared madness, whispering conversations with their dead child, setting aside portions of food for him, insisting to others that he was still alive, that he would join them soon. No one had the heart to confront their delusion. In the sewers, madness was perhaps the most rational response to an irrational situation. Christina Chiga, now 8 years old, had stopped asking when they could leave. She had been underground for so long that she no longer remembered what the sun looked like, what grass felt like under bare feet, what birds sounded like in the morning. Her entire world was darkness, rats, and whispered voices. Socha faced his own crisis in February of 1944. His wife Wanda confronted him after noticing that their savings had completely disappeared, that they were falling behind on rent, that their own daughter was going to bed hungry because he was feeding people who lived in sewage. She did not demand that he stop. She understood the moral stakes. but she asked him a question that haunted him for the rest of his life. She asked him whether he loved those people in the sewers more than he loved his own family, whether his need to be their savior was more important than his duty to his wife and child. Socha had no answer. He sat at their kitchen table, his head in his hands, and wept. But the next morning he descended into the sewers again. He brought bread, he brought water, he brought news. And he realized that Wanda's question had revealed a truth he had been avoiding. This was no longer about money. This had become his purpose, his identity, his reason for existing in a world that had lost all meaning. The group underground developed a collective awareness of sounds that became their early warning system for danger. They learned to distinguish between the normal flow of water and the sudden rush that indicated heavy rain above ground, which meant potential flooding and the need to move to higher sections of the tunnel network. They learned to recognize the echoing footsteps of other sewer workers, the clang of tools against metal, the voices of maintenance crews who occasionally ventured into nearby passages. When those sounds approached, everyone froze into absolute silence, barely breathing, their hearts hammering so loudly they were certain it could be heard through the walls. Children were taught that making any noise, even a whimper, even a cough, could mean death for everyone. Christina Chiga became so adept at silence that her mother sometimes checked to ensure she was still breathing. The child had learned to exist without existing, to become invisible even in the darkness. By spring of 1944, the group had been underground for nearly 11 months. 11 months without sunlight, 11 months without fresh air, 11 months of living in their own waste, of fighting rats for scraps, of listening to the city above them continue its life while they inhabited a realm of the dead. 2 more people had died, their bodies carried away by Socha in the same grim ritual. The survivors were skeletal, their skin covered in sores and infections, their teeth loose from scurvy, their eyes so adapted to darkness that even candlelight caused pain. They no longer looked human. They looked like creatures excavated from some archaeological nightmare, like evidence of a civilization that had burrowed into the earth to escape an apocalypse. And in a sense, that was exactly what they were. They were the last remnants of a community that had been erased from the surface, proof that even in the deepest darkness, the human will to survive could persist against all rational probability. In April of 1944, the sound of artillery fire began to penetrate the sewers. Distant at first, like thunder on a summer afternoon, but growing closer with each passing week. The refugees could not see the battle for Lviv, but they could hear it, feel it in the vibrations that shook loose centuries of accumulated grime from the brick ceiling. The Soviet Red Army was closing in, and the Wehrmacht was mounting a desperate defense of the city. Above ground, buildings were being reduced to rubble, streets were becoming graveyards, civilians were fleeing or hiding in basements, praying that the shells would miss their homes. But below ground in the sewers, the 20 remaining refugees faced a paradox that would have seemed absurd if it were not so terrifying. Liberation was coming, but liberation might kill them. A direct hit on the street above could collapse the tunnels, burying them alive. A ruptured water main could flood their chamber in seconds. The very salvation they had endured 14 months of hell to reach could arrive in the form of their tomb. Socha's visits became erratic as the battle intensified. Sometimes he appeared daily, breathless and wild-eyed, reporting that entire neighborhoods were burning, that Soviet tanks were rolling through the outskirts, that German soldiers were executing civilians suspected of aiding the enemy. Other times days passed with no sign of him, and the group descended into panic, convinced he had been killed, that they had been abandoned, that they would die in the darkness just as freedom arrived on the surface. During these absences, the food ran out completely. People survived on sewer water and whatever they could scavenge from the filth around them. Some ate rats they managed to kill, roasting the flesh over the camping stove until it was charred black, choking down meat that tasted of disease and waste. Others refused, choosing starvation over that final degradation. Ignacy Chiga, who had held the group together through force of will and moral authority, began to weaken visibly, his body consuming itself, his voice becoming a whisper, his leadership reduced to gentle suggestions rather than commands. The psychological toll of proximity to liberation was, in some ways, worse than the months of hopeless endurance. When there had been no end in sight, people had adapted to a kind of timeless existence, a suspended state where survival was the only goal. But now, with freedom measurable in days or weeks rather than abstract eternity, every hour became an agony of anticipation. People began to fantasize obsessively about the surface, about bread that was not moldy, about water that did not taste of sewage, about sleeping in a bed with sheets, about walking in sunlight, about breathing air that did not burn their lungs. These fantasies were simultaneously a source of hope and a form of torture, because each one carried the unspoken question that haunted every waking moment. What if they died now, this close to the end? What if they survived 14 months only to perish in the final week, the final day, the final hour? Socha appeared one afternoon in late July of 1944 with news that sent a shock through the group. The Germans were retreating. The Soviets had broken through the defensive lines and were entering the city center. The battle was effectively over. But Socha's face carried no joy, only a grim determination. He told them they could not leave yet. The streets were still dangerous, filled with retreating Wehrmacht soldiers who were shooting anything that moved, with Soviet advance units who might mistake them for German collaborators, with chaos and violence, and the unpredictable madness of a city changing hands. They had to wait, just a little longer, a few more days, maybe a week. The group received this news in stunned silence. They had survived 14 months in hell, and now they were being told to endure just a little more, to remain buried while liberation happened above their heads. Some people wept, others laughed, a sound that echoed through the tunnels like the cackle of demons. One man began screaming that he was leaving, that he was going to the surface right now, and it took 3 others to physically restrain him, to hold him down until his fury exhausted itself, and he collapsed into sobs. Socha made a decision during those final days that revealed the depth of his transformation. He began spending nights underground with the group, sleeping in the filth alongside them, sharing their deprivation rather than returning to the relative safety and comfort of his home above ground. He told Wanda he was doing this to ensure the group did not make a fatal mistake, did not emerge too early into a situation that could get them killed after everything they had endured. But the truth was simpler and more profound. These people had become his people. Their survival had become the organizing principle of his life, and he could not bear the thought of being separated from them in these final critical hours. He had descended into the sewers 14 months earlier as a man motivated by money and self-interest. He would emerge as something else entirely, something he himself could not fully name or understand, a righteous Gentile, a hero, a man who had looked into the abyss of human evil and chosen, against all logic and self-preservation, to be good. On July 27, 1944, Leopold Socha climbed down into the sewers for what he believed might be the final time as their protector. The sounds of gunfire had diminished to sporadic exchanges. Soviet flags were appearing on buildings throughout Lviv. The German occupation was collapsing. But Socha's face, illuminated by the flickering candle he carried, showed no relief. He gathered the group close and explained the new danger they faced. The Soviets were conducting sweeps of the city, rounding up anyone suspected of collaboration with the Nazis, anyone who could not prove their identity, anyone who looked suspicious or displaced. If the refugees emerged from the sewers, looking like the skeletal ghosts they had become, speaking Yiddish or Polish with the wrong accent, unable to produce documents or explain where they had been for the past year, they could be arrested, deported to labor camps in Siberia, or simply shot as potential threats. Freedom was here, but freedom was not safe. Socha proposed a plan that required every remaining ounce of trust the group could muster. He would go to the surface and make contact with the Soviet authorities. He would find officials who could provide documentation, who could verify the refugees' story, who could guarantee their safety. But this process would take time, possibly days, possibly longer. The group would have to remain underground, patient and silent, while he navigated the bureaucratic chaos of a city transitioning from Nazi to Soviet control. Some people objected immediately. A man named Weiss argued that Socha was lying, that he was abandoning them now that the danger had passed, that he had fulfilled his obligation and was washing his hands of their fate. Others defended Socha with a ferocity that surprised even themselves, insisting that he had earned their absolute trust, that doubting him now was a betrayal of everything he had risked. The argument threatened to split the group until Ignacy Chiga, weak but still authoritative, made the final decision. They would trust Socha. They would wait. They had come this far together, and they would finish together. The next 3 days were perhaps the most psychologically difficult of the entire ordeal. The group could hear celebrations above ground, voices singing Soviet anthems, the rumble of tanks moving through streets, the sounds of a city exhaling after years of occupation. They were meters below a world that was rejoicing in liberation, and they remained trapped in darkness, unable to participate, unable to confirm that the nightmare had truly ended. Food ran out again. The water tasted fouler than ever, as though the sewers themselves were protesting the Yanshu continuation of human presence. People stopped talking. They sat in the darkness, each alone with thoughts they could not share, counting heartbeats, counting breaths, waiting for Socha to return with news that they could finally ascend, finally reclaim their humanity, finally step into light that had become more myth than memory. Socha returned on the 30th of July with 2 Soviet officers, men who looked at the sewer entrance with visible disgust and disbelief. He had spent 3 days navigating Soviet military bureaucracy, telling and retelling the story of the Jews in the sewers, facing skepticism and mockery from officials who thought he was either lying or insane. But he had finally found a sympathetic captain, a man who agreed to provide documentation and safe passage if Socha could prove his story was true. And so Socha led these officers down into the darkness, through passages they had to navigate on hands and knees, through water that reached their thighs, to the chamber where 20 skeletal figures sat in filth, blinking at the sudden intrusion of flashlights, raising their hands to shield eyes that had not seen strong light in 14 months. The officers stood in stunned silence. One of them vomited. The other began to weep, openly and without shame, his tears mixing with the sewage that dripped from the ceiling. The ascent to the surface happened in stages over the next several hours. The refugees were too weak to climb the ladders unassisted, so Socha and the Soviet soldiers formed a human chain, passing bodies up one rung at a time. Kristina Chiga, now 9 years old, had to be carried, her legs too atrophied to support her weight. Her mother Paulina collapsed halfway up and had to be revived with water before continuing. Ignacy Chiga, the man who had led them into the sewers and kept them alive through force of will, was the last to emerge, insisting that everyone else go first, maintaining his responsibility to the end. When his head finally broke through the manhole cover into the afternoon sun of July 30th, 1944, he screamed. Not in joy, but in pain. The sunlight was so bright it felt like knives piercing his eyes. He covered his face with his hands and wept, his body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than language, deeper than thought, deeper than anything resembling human emotion in its civilized form. The 20 survivors stood on the street in the Halitsky district of Lviv, blinking in the sunlight like newborns torn from the womb. They did not look like people. They looked like archaeological specimens, like bodies excavated from some ancient disaster, and briefly animated before returning to dust. Their skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over bones that jutted at angles that defied anatomy. Their hair had fallen out in clumps, leaving patches of exposed scalp covered in sores and fungal infections. Their clothing, what remained of it, had rotted into rags that barely covered their bodies. The stench that rose from them was so overpowering that Soviet soldiers standing guard had to step back, had to cover their faces with handkerchiefs. Civilians who had gathered to witness this impossible resurrection crossed themselves and whispered prayers. Some thought they were looking at ghosts. Others thought they were looking at the risen dead. No one thought they were looking at people who had been alive and conscious for the past 14 months. A Soviet military doctor was summoned, a woman named Kowalska, who had seen the aftermath of German atrocities throughout eastern Poland, but who was still unprepared for what stood before her. She examined the refugees quickly, her hands moving with professional efficiency, even as her face betrayed horror. Every single person was suffering from severe malnutrition, their bodies having consumed their own muscle tissue to stay alive. Most had advanced cases of trench foot, their flesh rotted and gangrenous from constant immersion in sewage. Several showed signs of tuberculosis, their lungs scarred from breathing toxic air for over a year. All of them had parasitic infections, intestinal worms that had been feeding on whatever meager nutrition they managed to consume. Dr. Kowalska's preliminary assessment was that at least half of them would die within weeks from organ failure or infection. She recommended immediate hospitalization, quarantine, and intensive medical intervention. But hospitalization required beds, resources, medicine, all of which were in desperately short supply in a city that had just emerged from battle. The Soviets had neither the infrastructure nor the inclination to prioritize 20 Jewish refugees when thousands of Soviet soldiers needed treatment. Socha made another decision that would define his legacy. He took responsibility for the group's immediate care, convincing a local Polish family to provide temporary shelter in their basement, a space that was dry and clean and had access to fresh water. He used his remaining savings to purchase food, though the refugees could barely eat, their stomachs having shrunk to the point where more than a few bites induced vomiting. He found clothing, mismatched and ill-fitting but clean, and helped people bathe for the first time in over a year, the water in the wash basins turning black with accumulated filth. He tracked down a dentist willing to treat the refugees' rotting teeth. He located a pharmacist who could provide basic antibiotics. He became, in those first days after liberation, not just their rescuer but their caretaker, their advocate, their connection to a world that had moved on without them and had little interest in their survival now that the dramatic rescue was complete. The refugees struggled with a form of trauma that had no name in 1944, a psychological injury that would not be formally recognized until decades later when Holocaust survivors began telling their stories. They experienced what we now call dissociation, a fracturing of identity where the mind separates from the body to protect itself from unbearable reality. Paulina Chiga could not sleep in the basement room Socha had secured because the ceiling was too high, the space too open, the air too clean. She spent her first 3 nights on the surface, lying on the floor of a closet, the door closed, recreating the cramped darkness of the sewer chamber, because that environment, as horrific as it had become the only reality her mind could accept as safe. Others could not bear to be touched, flinching from any human contact after months of forced proximity underground. Christina Chiga refused to speak for 2 weeks, communicating only through gestures, her voice having retreated so far inward that even she could not find it. Leopold Socha visited the refugees daily during those first weeks, checking on their physical recovery, bringing small gifts of food or clothing, sitting with them in silence when words seemed inadequate, but he was wrestling with his own psychological crisis. For 14 months, his life had been organized around a singular purpose, a mission that gave meaning to every action, every risk, every sacrifice. Now that mission was complete. The Jews were safe, his obligation was fulfilled, and he discovered something that troubled him deeply. He did not know who he was without them. His entire identity had become wrapped up in being their protector, and without that role, he felt adrift, purposeless, hollow. He had saved 20 lives by risking his own and his family's, and he was being praised as a hero by the few people who knew the story. But heroism, he was learning, was not a feeling of triumph. It was a feeling of profound emptiness, a realization that the most meaningful thing he would ever do in his life was already behind him at age 35. The immediate aftermath of liberation revealed a truth more devastating than the refugees had allowed themselves to imagine during their months underground. The Lviv they had known, the vibrant Jewish community that had existed for centuries, was gone. Not diminished, not scattered, gone, completely erased. Of the 150,000 Jews who had lived in the city before the war, fewer than 1,000 had survived. The streets that had once echoed with Yiddish conversations, with the sounds of synagogue prayers, with children playing and merchants bargaining, were now silent in that specific way. The buildings still stood, but they housed different people now, Poles and Ukrainians who had moved into apartments vacated by murder, who slept in beds still warm from the families who had been dragged away. The refugees walked through these streets like ghosts, touring the ruins of their own civilization. searching for faces they would never see again, for landmarks that had been destroyed or repurposed, for any evidence that the world they remembered had been real, and not some fever dream conjured in the darkness. Ignacy Chiga began the grim work of accounting for the dead. He visited the offices of the Soviet-installed local government, requesting access to deportation records, execution lists, any documentation of what had happened to the Lviv Jewish community. The bureaucrats were polite but unhelpful, explaining that such records were classified, that they could not be released without authorization from higher authorities, that perhaps he should focus on rebuilding his life rather than dwelling on the past. But Chiga persisted, driven by a need that was almost religious in its intensity. He needed to know, he needed to document, he needed to bear witness to the annihilation so that it could not be denied or forgotten or minimized. Through these efforts, he learned that his extended family, 37 people including his parents, his siblings, his nieces and nephews, had been murdered at Belzec in the fall of 1942. His wife Paulina learned that her entire family, 23 people, had been killed during the liquidation of the ghetto in June of 1943, just days after they had descended into the sewers. Out of the 20 people who survived underground, not one had a single living relative outside their immediate group. The question of what happened next, where the survivors would go, became urgent as the weeks passed. Poland under Soviet occupation was not safe for Jews. The Red Army had liberated the concentration camps, had exposed the scale of Nazi atrocities, but anti-Semitism had not died with Hitler. In fact, in some regions of Poland, it intensified. There were reports of Jewish survivors returning to their former homes only to be murdered by Polish neighbors who had claimed their property and did not want to give it back. There were pogroms in towns like Kielce, where Jews who had survived the Holocaust were killed by Polish mobs in 1946, 2 years after liberation. The message was clear. There was no future for Jews in Poland. The survivors of the Lviv sewers understood this with a clarity that required no discussion. They had survived the Nazis. They would not survive a return to the world that had allowed the Nazis to flourish. They needed to leave. Leopold Socha helped facilitate their departure, using his connections in the city's underground networks to secure false documents, to arrange transportation westward, to find smugglers who could move people across borders that were officially closed. It was illegal, dangerous work that carried severe penalties under Soviet law. But Socha had crossed too many lines to stop now. He secured papers for the Chiga family that identified them as ethnic Poles being repatriated to Western territories. He arranged passage for others through the chaos of displaced persons camps that had sprung up across Europe. And one by one, over the course of 1945 and 1946, the survivors scattered. Some made their way to Palestine, the British Mandate territory that would soon become Israel. Others went to America, to Canada, to anywhere that would take them. They left Poland carrying almost nothing, just as they had entered the sewers carrying almost nothing. Refugees twice over, people without a country, without a home, without anything except the memories they wished they could forget. The parting between Socha and the refugees was not dramatic or cinematic. There were no grand speeches, no tearful embraces, no promises to stay in touch that everyone knew would be impossible to keep. When Ignacy Chiga and his family prepared to leave Lviv in the spring of 1945, Socha came to see them off at the train station. They stood on the platform, two men who had shared an experience so profound it had altered them at the cellular level, and they struggled to find words adequate to the moment. Chiga thanked Socha, a word so insufficient it felt like an insult. Socha told Chiga to live well, to remember the others who had not survived. They shook hands. The train arrived. The Chigas boarded, and as the train pulled away, Socha stood on the platform, watching until the cars disappeared around a bend, watching until there was nothing left to watch, and then he turned and walked back into a city that would never know what he had done. Leopold Socha returned to his life as a municipal sewer worker in Soviet-occupied Lviv, a city that was being systematically transformed from a Polish cultural center into a Ukrainian Soviet republic. The streets were renamed. The language shifted. The population was being reshaped through deportations and forced migrations. and Socha moved through this changing landscape as he had moved through the sewers, quietly, efficiently, attracting no attention. He did not speak about what he had done during the German occupation. When co-workers asked how he had survived the war years, he shrugged and said he had kept his head down, done his job, stayed out of trouble. The truth was too dangerous to share. In the Soviet system, having had extensive contact with Jews, having hidden enemies of the Reich could be interpreted as collaboration with capitalist elements or Zionist conspiracies. The same actions that might have earned him recognition as a hero in a different context could get him deported to Siberia in the paranoid atmosphere of Stalinist Poland. The psychological weight of his secret ate at him slowly, like the sewage had eaten at the brick walls of the tunnels. He began drinking more heavily, spending evenings in local bars, consuming vodka until his hands stopped shaking and his mind stopped replaying the same scenes over and over. The rats, the smell, the moment he had carried Weinberg's body through the darkness. The look in Christina Chiga's eyes when she emerged into sunlight and screamed. His wife Wanda watched him spiral with a mixture of compassion and helplessness. She had supported his decision to save the Jews, had accepted the financial devastation it brought to their family, had lived with the terror of potential discovery for 14 months. But now she was living with a different kind of devastation, watching the man she loved become a ghost in his own life, haunted by memories he could not share and could not escape. She begged him to talk to a priest, to find some form of absolution or peace. But Socha refused. He did not want absolution. He did not feel guilty. He felt hollow. In 1946, 2 years after the liberation, Socha received a letter. It had been smuggled into Poland through underground networks, passed from hand to hand until it reached him. It was from Ignacy Chiga, who was now living in Israel with his family. The letter was brief, just a few paragraphs, but it conveyed something that Socha had not realized he needed desperately. Chiga wrote that he and the other survivors spoke of Socha often, that they told their children about the man who had saved them, that they prayed for him and his family. He wrote that Socha's actions had given them not just life, but the ability to believe that goodness could exist even in the darkest circumstances. And he wrote that if Socha ever wanted to leave Poland, if he ever wanted to start a new life somewhere else, Chiga would help him, would sponsor him, would ensure that he and his family could escape the Soviet system. Socha read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He never responded. He never told Wanda about the offer. He remained in Lviv, in the city where he had performed his miracle, as though leaving would somehow diminish it or betray it. On May 12, 1946, Leopold Socha was struck by a truck while riding his bicycle home from work. The accident happened on Lychakivska Street, a main thoroughfare he had traveled thousands of times. Witnesses said he swerved suddenly, as though avoiding something in the road, and veered directly into the path of a Soviet military transport vehicle. He was killed instantly, his body thrown 15 feet by the impact. He was 37 years old. The official report listed the death as an accident, driver negligence compounded by poor road conditions. But there were whispers in the city, rumors that Socha had been targeted, that Soviet authorities had discovered his wartime activities and arranged the accident to eliminate a potential source of embarrassment or complication. Nothing was ever proven. The investigation was cursory. The driver faced no charges. And Leopold Socha was buried in Lychakiv Cemetery in a small ceremony attended by his widow, his daughter, and a handful of co-workers who knew nothing of what he had actually accomplished. News of Socha's death reached the survivors slowly, passed through the same underground networks that had delivered Chiga's letter. The response was immediate and visceral. Paulina Chiga collapsed when she heard, weeping for hours, inconsolable in her grief. Others organized a memorial service in Tel Aviv, gathering in a small synagogue to recite Kaddish for a Catholic Pole, an unprecedented act that reflected the bond that transcended religious and ethnic boundaries. Ignacy Chiga wrote a detailed account of Socha's actions during the war, documenting everything he could remember, determined that the story would not die with the man, but he faced a problem that would persist for decades. The world was not ready to hear stories about righteous Gentiles who had saved Jews. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, The narrative was focused on Jewish suffering and survival, on building the State of Israel, on prosecuting war criminals. The stories of non-Jews who had risked everything to help were pushed to the margins, considered less important, less urgent, less worthy of attention. Socha's heroism was known to 20 people and ignored by history. For 44 years, the story of Leopold Socha and the 21 Jews who survived in the sewers of Lviv remained buried almost as deeply as the tunnels themselves. The survivors scattered across the globe, rebuilding lives from the wreckage of their past, raising children who would grow up in Israel, in America, in Canada, children who heard fragments of the story but could never fully comprehend the reality of 14 months in darkness. Ignacy Chiga worked tirelessly to document what had happened, writing memoir after memoir, submitting testimony to Holocaust archives, but his efforts gained little traction. The world was focused on Auschwitz, on Treblinka, on the industrialized death camps with their gas chambers and crematoria. The story of a handful of people hiding in sewage seemed small by comparison, too strange, too grotesque, too difficult to fit into the emerging narrative of Holocaust remembrance. And so it remained hidden, known only to those who had lived it and those who had heard it whispered in living rooms late at night. The transformation began in 1990, when a Polish filmmaker named Robert Marshall heard about the story and recognized its extraordinary cinematic and moral power. He tracked down the survivors, now elderly men and women living across 3 continents, and convinced them to tell their story on camera. The resulting documentary brought the story to wider attention, and slowly, painfully slowly, recognition began to arrive. In 1978, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust memorial, had already recognized Leopold Socha as righteous among the nations, the highest honor Israel bestows on non-Jews who saved Jewish lives during the Holocaust. A tree was planted in his name in the Garden of the Righteous in Jerusalem. His widow Wanda, who had lived in poverty in Poland for decades, was finally acknowledged as a hero alongside her husband. But it would take until 2011, 67 years after the liberation, for the story to reach mass audiences through the film In Darkness, a harrowing cinematic adaptation that was nominated for an Academy Award and introduced millions of people to a story that had been forgotten by everyone except those who had lived it. Today, if you visit Lviv, the city now firmly within the borders of Ukraine, you will find almost no trace of the Jewish community that once thrived there. The synagogues have been converted to other uses or demolished. The cemetery where generations of Jewish families were buried has been paved over. The streets where Yiddish was the dominant language now echo with Ukrainian and Russian. But beneath those streets, the sewers remain. The same tunnels that Leopold Socha navigated with such precision are still there, still flowing with the city's waste, still home to rats the size of small dogs. Occasionally, tour groups descend into cleaned sections of the system, walking through passages where tourists can experience a sanitized version of what the refugees endured. But these tours last an hour, maybe 2, and participants emerge grateful for the sunlight, unable to imagine what 14 months in that darkness would do to the human mind and body. The survivors who lived to see the recognition of their story struggled with complex emotions about its emergence from obscurity. Christina Chiga, who had been 7 years old when she descended into the sewers and 21 when she finally felt safe enough to speak about it publicly, described the experience as simultaneously validating and re-traumatizing. Every interview, every documentary, every film screening required her to return mentally to the chamber, to smell the sewage, to feel the rats crawling over her body, to remember the desperate hunger and the paralyzing fear. She did it anyway, driven by the same sense of obligation that had driven her father Ignacy, the need to ensure that Socha's heroism was not forgotten, that his sacrifice was recognized, that his name was spoken with reverence rather than lost to the indifference of history. She spoke at schools, at Holocaust memorials, at conferences, always ending her testimony the same way. She would say that Leopold Socha had taught her that even in the darkest place imaginable, goodness could survive, that even when the world descended into madness, individual human beings could choose to be decent. The story of the Lviv sewers is not a story about Jewish suffering, though suffering permeates every moment of the narrative. It is not a story about Nazi evil, though evil was the catalyst for everything that followed. It is a story about a man who was not supposed to be a hero, who began his involvement for money and ended it because he had discovered something within himself that he had not known existed. A capacity for sustained moral courage that defied self-interest, that defied logic, that defied every survival instinct. Leopold Socha saved 21 people by risking his life every single day for 14 months. And he did it without the expectation of reward, without the guarantee of recognition, without even the certainty that any of them would survive. He did it because, in the end, he could not do otherwise. And that is the kind of heroism that America, that the world, needs to remember in an age where moral clarity seems increasingly difficult to find. The heroism of ordinary people who, when confronted with the choice between complicity and courage, between silence and action, between darkness and a small flickering light, choose to descend into the sewers and become something greater than themselves.